Hey Parkway, I'm here in Brookshire, Texas at the Hangar Unity Center with my man Ryan, who is the director of the Hangar through an organization called Eyes on Me, and doing some great work here, helping rebuild the shed, doing some shelves, doing some work to really help their facility and their infrastructure. This is also the organization that you were so generous to donate over 1,000 toys for kids at Christmas this year, which we're going to be giving out. We're so thankful. But just want to introduce you to Ryan. Ryan, tell us a little bit about what the Hangar is about and what God's doing here.
Sure, yeah. So the Hangar Unity Center came from a vision of God several years ago. The property we're on was actually the old segregated school up until 1968, and God has transformed it. And it's the Hangar Unity Center, a place where life takes flight. And we just believe God's writing a story of community transformation here in Brookshire, and we're just so glad to be a part of it. So thank you guys so much for your ongoing support, and I can't wait to see what else God wants to do with this relationship in the future, just to help bring and catalyze change in this community.
And just so you can see what your generosity does, what your generosity looks like when you are faithful to give through the Christmas offering every year, your money is being put to work, put to action, and lives are actually being changed. It's pretty amazing. So thank you so much, and we'll see you soon.
Isn't that awesome? Way to go, Parkway. Way to go. Hey, any men here that were on that work day? Anybody by chance? Anybody? No, none of you were here. Okay, fantastic. Maybe next time, huh? Hey, listen, have you ever gotten that call? You know, the one that comes in at 2 a.m., you're afraid to answer because you know that if you answer it, it's probably going to change everything. When you get that call, what's the first thing that you do? Well, today we're going to talk about what God says is the first thing that you should do when crisis comes calling. Now, in my 55 laps around the sun and over 35 years of pastoral ministry, I've received my fair share of crisis calls. And today, I want to tell you about two of those calls that I've received. The first was from my son Josh, just after he started driving. Now, driving is a rite of passage that's marked by parents who are terrified every time their kids pull out of the driveway, okay? Because here's the deal. It doesn't matter how well you've prepared them. It doesn't matter, how skilled they are as a driver. It just takes one small mistake, one distraction, or somebody else's bad decision, and it could change everything, and then you get a call like I got a call from Josh. It was at night, and Josh did not see the car that had stopped at the intersection, and so he rear-ended that car, and then that car rear-ended the car in front of him. And, thankfully nobody was seriously injured, but he called me when the police were kind of getting things sorted out, and as soon as I answered the call and heard that he had been in an accident, my heart just kind of jumped up into my throat. I went into full-on dad mode and immediately screamed into the phone, "Are you okay?" Which sent Jennifer into full-on mom mode, and she started screaming, "What's going on? What's wrong? What happened? Is he okay? What's going on?" And I am immediately, being the good husband that I am, scream, "Woman, quiet! I can't hear what he's saying." And she's like, "Don't call me woman." And you can just kind of see how the next, segment of our life played out, right? Getting dressed, grabbing keys, getting to the scene, wondering if Josh is okay or in trouble, trying to figure out what happened, talking to the police, getting contact info, insurance info, police contact info, calling tow trucks, getting everybody back in the car and back home, and then just collapsing in a heap. Now, did you notice what didn't happen in that scenario? Didn't turn to God at all. Didn't ask him for peace. Didn't ask him to be with Josh. Didn't ask him to be with me and Jennifer. Didn't ask him to bring, clarity and calm to the situation. None of that. It was just pure adrenaline-fed reaction. And thank goodness there was nothing life-changing that took place that night. Now, one of the most common reasons that people leave the faith today is just because of a crisis or because something bad happens in their life. They experience a crisis and it causes them to doubt God. When they have a crisis or when something bad happens, it's as if they, doubt, well, if God was really real, then this wouldn't have happened, or if God really loved me, then this wouldn't happen. And then the enemy takes that little doubt and drives a wedge in between you and God, and people tend to no longer put God in first place in their life, or worse, they walk away from pursuing Jesus altogether. Maybe it's an unexpected death. Somebody has a tragic accident and they're no longer here. Maybe it's betrayal. A spouse walks away, or even worse, walks into the arms of somebody else. Maybe it's some other hardship, a unexplained or unexpected diagnosis, a prolonged illness, or maybe a really painful surgery. Maybe it's a financial crisis. You lose your job or your business goes under. Maybe it's a combination of several of those things that happen all at once. Maybe you know someone that has happened to, or maybe I've just described something that you are walking through, and you're here today and your faith is hanging on by a thread. Well, listen, I'm glad you're here, because I believe that today God wants to tell you that in spite of the crisis you're walking through, that He loves you, that He's with you, and He is not abandoning you. And you can stand tall in your faith and walk with Him through the crisis. So, how do you stand tall in your faith when a crisis happens? To answer that, we're going to be looking at the second chapter of the book of Daniel. And what we find here happened in 587 BC. The Babylonians overrun the nation of Israel, and they destroy Jerusalem and the temple. And they take a huge percentage of the population back to Babylon as slaves. And there were 4 young men who were a part of that. They were Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And they're put into a training program to become advisors or servants to the king. And when they do this, they resolve in their heart to stand tall in their faith for God in this ungodly culture. And because they do that, we found out in the first chapter of Daniel that God blessed them with extra intelligence and extra wisdom and extra gifts. So much so that the king sees that they're far greater gifted than any of his current advisors. And so he makes Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego advisors to the king as well. Well, today we're going to discover how they stand tall for God when a crisis happens. And again, all of this, it takes place in the second chapter of Daniel. Here's the deal. It's a really long chapter. And instead of reading all of it, we're going to just look at some selected verses. But I would really encourage you, take some time this week and read the second chapter of Daniel. It's going to be incredible for you. Okay, so here's what happens in the second chapter of Daniel. King Nebuchadnezzar has a really powerful and vivid dream that disturbs him. He doesn't know what the dream means. I mean, it just kind of rocks his world. And so he goes to all of his advisors and he says, I've had this very vivid dream and it's disturbed me. So you're my advisors and this is what I want you to do. First, I want you to tell me what I dreamed or what I dreamt. And then second, I want you to tell me what it means. Okay. Here's the deal though. He goes, if you get it right, I'm going to reward you handsomely. But if you get it wrong, I'm going to kill you. Literally, he says he'll have them cut into pieces and their homes turned into piles of rubble. That's a crisis, isn't it? I mean, that is a crisis. Here's the deal. Some of you husbands can relate to being in between a rock and a hard place. In a no-win situation. I'm curious, how many of you husbands have ever had your wife wake up at you mad because you cheated on her in her dream? Yeah, me neither. Me neither. So, okay, I think I may have just lost the room here. Because right now, this is wild. All across the room, all the wives are going, but it was so real. and all the husbands are, doing the face palm and shaking their heads, and now the wives are all mad because you're not acknowledging their feelings, and it's a crisis. Listen, we've got marriage and family counselors at guest services. No, we don't. We don't. But that really felt like a crisis, didn't it? You can relate. But here's the deal. It really was a crisis for the advisors of the king. Because if they didn't tell the king what he dreamt, or what the dream meant, it was going to be rough for them. So here's the deal. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they're also caught in this crisis because they're also advisors to the king. So here's your first fill-in, and it's the foundation of what you need to know in order to stand tall in your faith when a crisis happens. The crisis comes to everyone. The crisis comes to everybody. The crisis comes to everybody. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were not exempt from the crisis because they had resolved to stand tall for God. Sometimes Christ followers think that because you've become a Christ follower, that you will no longer have any crisis in your life. There are some people who think that because you follow Jesus, that nothing bad is supposed to happen to you. Well, here's the deal. That just isn't true. In fact, nowhere did Jesus say anything like that. In fact, he says the opposite in John 16:33. Let's see what Jesus says about trouble. I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart. I have overcome the world. You see, Jesus never promises to give us a trouble-free life. He never says that we won't have to go through crisis. He never says that bad things won't happen. In fact, he says the opposite, that they will happen, but take heart because he's overcome them. And when you stand tall in your faith and walk with him through it, he'll give you his peace. It's pretty cool, isn't it? So here's the deal. You need to know that as a Christ follower, God has not given you a trouble-free life. Because if you believe that, you make it easy for the enemy to deceive you when the crisis comes. You make it easy to believe that, because things are going wrong in your life, then God must not really be a God who keeps his promises. And you can't trust him, and he doesn't love you, so you should just walk away. But if you know that you will have trouble, if you know that you're going to experience a crisis, that you're going to walk through difficult times, you're going to have hardship and pain and anguish, when you know that, you can prepare for it ahead of time. So when the crisis comes, you can stand tall in your faith and turn to Jesus and say, help me have your peace as I go through this. Here's your next fill-in. And it's what you need to do first in order to stand tall when the crisis happens. Don't reason, turn to God and pray. Don't reason, but turn to God and pray. Let's take a look at how the advisors and then how Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, how they respond to the crisis. First, we're going to look at the advisors, and we're going to read verses 10 through 11 in chapter 2. The astrologers answered the king, "There is no one on earth who can do what the king asks. No king, however great and mighty, has ever asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or astrologer. What the king asks is too difficult. No one can reveal it to the king except the gods, and they do not live among humans." So the first thing that the advisors do is they try to reason with the king. They're like, hey, come on, King Nebuchadnezzar. You can't really expect us to know what you dreamed in your dream. Like, nobody can do that. Nobody can do that. It's really unreasonable to think that we could do that. Here's the deal, though. You can't reason with an unreasonable king. And you can't reason with a crisis either. You can't When your car's wrapped around a pole, you can't say to the pole, well, you shouldn't have been there. And when your spouse walks away, you can't convince them of the generational damage that they're going to do to the kids and the grandkids. And when you hear the terminal news and the diagnosis from the doctor, all of your hopes and dreams for the future, they just don't count anymore. You can't reason with a crisis because oftentimes there's just simply no reason in it. So let's look at verses 16 through 18 and see how Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, how they respond. At this, Daniel went to the king and asked for time so that he might interpret the dream for him. Then Daniel returned to his house and explained the matter to his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Those were the Hebrew names of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He urged them to plead for mercy from God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that he and his friends might not be executed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. When Daniel finds out about the crisis, he doesn't try to reason with the king. He turns to God. He knows that the only way, the only response is through the response that God gives him. And so he goes to the king and he says, hey, king, give me a night to pray to my God, and then tomorrow I'm going to interpret the dream. And then he goes and he finds his buddies and he says, we need to pray like nobody's business that God tells us what he dreamed and what it means. It doesn't say this in the Bible, but I have a hunch he didn't just stop with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I think he probably asked everybody he knew, hey, would you pray that God would interpret this dream? I think he probably said to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you get all your friends and send people out to all the rest of the people from Israel who are in captivity here in Babylon. Let's get as many people praying as we possibly can. See, when Daniel finds out, the first thing he does is he goes to the Lord to pray. And he asks his friends to have his back in prayer as well. Here's the deal. The same is true for you. Listen, a crisis may take you by surprise, but a crisis never takes God by surprise. You may not know how to respond to a crisis, but God always knows the perfect response. And the only way for you to know what God's perfect response is to go to him in prayer and to ask and to seek and to let him lead. So listen, don't waste time doing anything else. When the crisis comes, give it to God. Don't go it alone. Ask all of your friends who are Christ followers to pray with you and pray for you. Listen, that's why it's so important to have a network of Christ followers in your life, a support network, people who can lift you up. And honestly, that's one of the greatest things about being in a small group is they have your back. When you need it, they've got your back. Listen, we're about to start a new semester of small groups, and in a couple weeks, we're going to open up signups for those groups. If you're not in a group, man, get in a group. Here's your final fill-in, and it's what you're actually doing as you stand tall in your faith when a crisis happens. Give God an opportunity to make himself great. That's what you're doing. You're giving God an opportunity to make himself great. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they go to God in prayer, and God does his thing. Let's check out verse 19. During the night, the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision. Then Daniel praised the God of heaven. God answers prayers. In the middle of the night, God tells Daniel what the dream was and what it meant. But here's the deal. We need to understand this. God didn't reveal the dream to Daniel just for Daniel's sake. Yes, Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they're saved from being cut into pieces and their homes being turned into piles of rubble. But God revealed the dream so that he could make himself great in the eyes of the king. Let's see what happens in verses 26 through 28. The king asked Daniel, also called Belshazzar, "Are you able to tell me what I saw in my dream and interpret it?" Daniel replied, I love this, "No wise man, enchanter, magician, or diviner can explain to the king the mystery he's asked about, but there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. He has shown King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in days to come. Your dream and the visions that passed through your mind as you were lying in bed are these." And then Daniel goes on to tell him what he dreamt and what it meant. Don't you love that? Daniel didn't say to the king, "I will tell you what the dream is, and I will interpret it." No, Daniel said, nobody can do that. No human can do what you're asking, but there's a God in heaven, and he's going to tell you what the dream is and what it means. See, Daniel understood that the crisis was actually an opportunity for God to make himself great to the king. So let's look what happens in verses 46 through 49. Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell prostrate before Daniel and paid him honor and ordered that an offering and incense be presented to him. The king said to Daniel, "Surely your God is the God of gods and the Lord of kings and the revealer of mysteries, for you were able to reveal this mystery." Then the king placed Daniel in a high position and lavished many gifts on him. He made him ruler over the entire province of Babylon and placed him in charge of all its wise men. Moreover, at Daniel's request, the king appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego administrators over the province of Babylon, while Daniel himself remained at the royal court. Did you hear what the king said? "Surely your God is the God of gods and the Lord of kings." That would have never happened if Daniel and his boys hadn't gone through the crisis. See, Daniel allowed God to be honored and lifted up through the crisis that they were in. And as a result, God made himself great to the king. And Daniel and his boys got an even more influential placement within that kingdom. So you need to learn this. In the crisis that you're walking through, there's an opportunity for God to make himself great through your crisis. There's someone in your life that God has gotten their attention because of what you're struggling with. And God will reach them through you if you remain faithful and stand tall in faith. And if you're willing to share your faith with them. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. You're going, I don't really know what to say to anybody to get them to come to faith, and if I say the wrong thing, then I'm probably going to, cause them to never come to God. Well, that's not true, but I get it. I understand. It can be scary when you're trying to share your faith with people. So here's the deal. We're going to give you an easy button today. This is a simple way that you can share your faith without having the right things to say. Invite them to church. Because guess what we do every Sunday morning here? We share the gospel and we give people who aren't Christ followers the opportunity to become a Christ follower. So when you invite people in your life to come and be a part of what's happening here at Parkway, they're going to be able to hear the gospel and have a chance to respond. And I want to tell you about something that's happening coming up on January 28th. We're beginning our next series on that date, and it's called Modern Romance. It's going to be awesome. It's all about romance and marriage and relationships. I mean, it is really powerful stuff, but here's the deal. The entire series has been designed to help people who aren't Christ followers be able to easily become Christ followers. What a great opportunity for you to invite people in your life to come and hear and respond. Because here's the deal, when you do that, you know what might actually happen? They might go, you know what? If God is such a big deal to them with everything that they're walking through, maybe there's something in there for me too. Give God an opportunity to make himself great through your crisis. You know, earlier, I told you that I was going to tell you about 2 crisis calls that I received. The first one was when my son Josh was in a traffic accident. But the second call came just before last Easter. My wife was on the line and her voice was shaken and bordering on the verge of tears. She had just spoken to our daughter Mariah, who had just been to the ear, nose, and throat doctor, who had told her that she has a brain tumor and that she needed to go to MD Anderson immediately. The world stopped that day. And over the next couple of weeks, we discovered that it wasn't a brain tumor. It was a tumor in her sinuses that had grown through her nasal cavity to her brain and had also wrapped around one of her eyes. It's a cancer called rhabdomyosarcoma. It's extremely rare in adults and it's extremely aggressive. Crisis is an understatement. Gut punch is really insufficient, and hit over the head with a 2x4 probably comes the closest, but honestly, words can't describe what you go through when you find out what your baby girl is about to walk through. But unlike that first call I received, with this call, the first thing that my wife and I did was cry out to God in prayer. And over the last month, it has 9 months, it's been the consistent thing that we have done. And we've asked everyone to pray for our daughter for healing. Our small group has had our backs. Friends and family have been consistently lifting Mariah up in prayer for healing. Mariah has been amazing. Her head and her heart are in the right place, and she has been so brave and so fierce in her fight. 9 months of chemo, 6 weeks of radiation sprinkled into the middle of that, and all the while continuing to stand tall in her faith and share the gospel with her high school friends at Tompkins High School through the ministry of Young Life. And she's still fighting the fight. And we're still continuing to pray and ask God for her healing. And honestly, we're still not sure exactly what God is doing in all of this, how he's going to make himself great through it. But one day we will, even if it's on the other side of heaven. But I do know this: God has been tremendously faithful. Last month, Mariah finished her last round of chemo. And while the doctors are not calling her cancer-free, and there's still future scans and probably future treatments, her last scan showed that the tumor had completely disappeared. And that is great news. Now our prayers have shifted from God, please take the tumor away, to please don't let it come back. And I hope that you'll join us in our prayers for Mariah as well. And let me say this: when the crisis calls have come in my life, I am so glad that I've been able to turn to God and do my best to stand tall in my faith, because I have this assurance and I have this hope that Jesus is with me. So what about you? Do you have that hope? Do you have that assurance? Listen, if you've never become a Christ follower, you can't turn to God first, because you don't have a restored relationship with God. See, because of your sin, you're separated from God. And until your sin is dealt with, you can't respond, and God can't respond. So how do you deal with your sin? Well, the honest truth is you can't. There's nothing that you can do in your own ability that can take care of your sin. But the good news is that despite that truth, Jesus already has taken care of your sin. When he died on the cross, He died to take the punishment for your sin. And when he was brought back to life by God, he gives us the opportunity to have a new life in a restored relationship with God through faith in him. And the Bible teaches that if you believe that Jesus died on the cross to take away your sin, and if you'll ask God to forgive you, and if you'll make a commitment in your heart to let him lead and guide your life moving forward, that you'll be forgiven, that you'll be restored in your relationship with God, and when the crisis comes, you can turn to him first. The way you become a Christ follower is by praying a prayer of faith. We've printed a sample prayer of faith for you. It's in your message notes. If you're watching online, it'll pop up on the screen. But if you want to become a Christ follower today, you can pray that prayer right now, and I hope you do. Why don't you pray that prayer while I close all of us in prayer? Father, I love you, and I am so thankful that I have this hope and assurance that even though crisis and pain and suffering come, that I have the peace of knowing you and being able to walk with you through your Son, Jesus. So God, my prayer for all of us today would be this, that we would understand that trouble will come. And when it comes, we can turn to you in faith and have your peace. And Father, my prayer for my friends would be that when the crisis comes and when they receive those calls, that immediately they would turn to you in prayer. And as they do that in faith, God, would you respond and lead them and guide them and give them your presence and your peace. Help us, God, in being able to see how you are going to make yourself great through the crisis. Help us to walk in faith, knowing that there is a greater plan and a greater purpose at work. And again, help us make it through. We love you, and it's in your Son's name we pray. Amen.